In the previous videos, I outlined to you the origins and initial successes of a West German foreign policy initiative called Ostpolitik, as well as presented to you the foundational ideas and intellectual origins of modern Polish foreign policy in the exiled Polish dissident community of Paris and its magazine, Kultura. In this video, I will explain to you why Ostpolitik failed. This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free PC and mobile military strategy online game set in the late 20th and early 21st century. The player takes control of an existing nation on a real-time world map in which players move units in real time on a modern battlefield, fighting up to 128 players in campaigns that can take weeks to complete. You can play the same game on both your PC and mobile account. Over 100 detailed units of modern weapons systems, from attack helicopters to stealth fighters to nuclear submarines and more, are available at the player's command. Careful planning and strategy is required by players, as the tasks the player puts on units can take a lot of time to complete. The player also has to carefully plan and invest in his nation's infrastructure and military development to keep an edge over opponents. An extensive military tech tree with 250 research items is available to the player to prioritize certain units, strategies, and tactics. The player can also engage his opponents in temporary alliances in a quest for global dominance. Click the link in the description to get an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and a 1-month premium subscription for the next 30 days. Thank you to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. By the end of the 1970s, the Cold War intensified again, as the Soviet-American efforts for arms control and peaceful cooperation that had dominated much of the 1970s came to an end. Officially, Brezhnev was still in charge of the Soviet Union, but behind the scenes, the KGB leader Andropov began amassing power. And as Brezhnev turned into a vegetable, Andropov was increasingly in charge by the late 1970s. Andropov was a Kremlin hawk, just as everyone else in power in the Kremlin from 1977 to 1985. With Andropov in power, the Soviets engaged in aggressive foreign policy moves again, moving medium-range nuclear missiles into the Warsaw Pact, invading Afghanistan, and aggressively pursuing more influence in Africa. The West also became more hawkish starting in 1979, mainly through the conservative and neoliberal revolutions that brought figures like Thatcher and Reagan into power, together with a more confrontational attitude toward the Soviet Union. If it was the West or the East that initiated this new round of Cold War aggression is a chicken or egg debate that we are not going to have here in this video. The new German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was very much part of this new conservative political wave across the wider West. But unlike Reagan and Thatcher, Kohl was not elected into power. He became German Chancellor because the Liberals betrayed the Social Democratic coalition partner and formed a new coalition with the Conservatives. The Liberals had done that because of Helmut Schmidt's increasing unpopularity, and the reason Helmut Schmidt had become increasingly unpopular was because he had approved of the deployment of American medium-range nuclear weapons in Germany, as a response to the Soviet Union moving medium-range nuclear missiles into the Warsaw Pact. The German public protested this because they saw it as a break with Ostpolitik, and Ostpolitik was very popular with the German public. And as much as the conservatives liked to rail against Ostpolitik when they were in opposition, they had no choice but to continue it if they wanted to get a chance at re-election. And so the Kohl government embarked on a mission to adopt Ostpolitik as their own. Kohl announced that all treaties the previous government had signed would be continued and good neighborly relations with East Germany pursued. Ostpolitik continued, but the emphasis changed from diplomacy to trade. Wandel durch Annäherung gradually became Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. An underlying assumption in the Kohl foreign policy was that an increase of trade between the two states would inevitably lead to good relations and a possible democratization of East Germany. This was part of a wider trend that began in the 1980s as neoliberal foreign policy ideas took hold. The idea that open markets and trade could, over time, democratize countries. And it is also here where Ostpolitik began to fail, because it constituted a major difference between the approach of Kohl and the approach of Brandt and Schmidt. The Social Democrats may have opened trade between the two Germanys, but their main focus and motivation was not trade in itself. Trade was merely a lubricant, opening the doors to wider diplomacy and policies. Kohl saw trade as a foreign policy in itself, and thereby, policy was in some ways deemed unnecessary in foreign policy. This is not how Ostpolitik was conceptualized by the German Social Democrats, or even why it worked to succeed. Sure, trade played a role, but the purpose of foreign policy is the policy part. The number one priority of Schmidt and Brandt was to establish a diplomatic framework for de-escalation and peace in Europe, and to persuade Moscow to open the doors and allow West Germany to build deeper relations with East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Trade was a means to an end and not the end of the means. They believed that diplomatic relations, diplomatic treaties, mutual recognition, cultural and political exchange, and general political interaction was the driving motor of change. A weakness of this new neoliberal approach and the call to foreign policy was that Germany surrendered the powers of politics to markets. Under this foreign policy, there is no longer a need to negotiate common understandings on issues of human rights, resolve diplomatic quarrels, create mutual understanding, arms control, or any such policies, because, supposedly, the markets will sort it out. This surrender of the need for actual policy is what doomed Ostpolitik. The second reason for why Ostpolitik started to fail was the hyper-focus on Russia, with a disregard for everyone else living between Moscow and Berlin. A goal of Ostpolitik, as mentioned before, was for Germany to negotiate better relations with Warsaw Pact states, and not just the Soviet Union. The Social Democrats had negotiated with Moscow because the Warsaw Pact states were Soviet puppets, and therefore Moscow had to open the door for Germany. The Kohl government increasingly only talked to Moscow, because why talk to the countries between Germany and Moscow when they are little more than Soviet puppets? Moscow was seen as the master of these states that dictated where the entire region would go anyway. So talking to Moscow was seen as the only thing that mattered. Now, this may have been a somewhat justifiable line of thought back in the 1980s, but this developed into a habit that outlived the Cold War. Kohl continued doing this focus on Russia after the end of the Cold War. The German government continued talking to Moscow as if it was still the overlord of Eastern Europe, even though it no longer was. This thinking persisted for decades after Helmut Kohl, under both Schröder and Merkel, throughout 30 years of German foreign policy after unification. Emphasis in Ostpolitik lay in open markets. Throughout the 2000s, German governments worked under the assumption that mutual economic entanglement would over time democratize Russia and turn it into a normal European state. Diplomatically creating pressure for more democratic Russian governance, respect for human rights, freedom of the press, and mutual understandings in matters of security were largely sidelined. And the thing about these decisions were that they were not really political decisions in the first place. Just trade deals under the neoliberal assumption that they would somehow magically enable democracy in Russia. The Politik part of Ostpolitik was essentially replaced with a mark and the Ost replaced with Russland. And here lies one of the main lessons that we should learn from the failure of the last 30 years of German foreign policy. Trade is not a substitute for policy. In the end, the consequences of this new Ostpolitik were little more than disastrous. It increased the wealth of an undemocratic Russian oligarchy, thereby furthering the dismantling of the weak democratic institutions of Russia, and as we unfortunately know today, much of the revenue from the trade agreements went into building a Russian army for the purpose of aggression and the destruction of a common European security framework. Ironically, that framework for European security and peace that was destroyed in 2022 was successfully established by the Ostpolitik of Brandt and Schmidt. Over the course of 30 years, it was undermined by the reimagined Ostpolitik of Kohl, Schröder and Merkel. There was an additional consequence of this emphasis on Russia over everyone else. The countries in between were seen as irrelevant, possibly even as developing countries, where decisions could be made over their heads between Germany and Russia, and they would all just have to pull along in the end. In one case, quite literally, the Nord Stream pipelines are almost a physical manifestation and monument to a German understanding of the countries between them and Russia as irrelevant and inconsequential. Germany developed delusions of grandeur throughout the 2000s. It began seeing itself not just as a European partner among multiple European equals, but as a European power that could speak on behalf of Europe at large, especially after the Euro crisis of 2010, while Germany ignored any warnings over its deepening ties to Russia and that it may be putting European security at risk. But just because German leaders talked over the countries between her and Russia, that didn't mean that those countries just stopped existing and didn't pursue their own foreign policy ideas and agendas. A German disinterest in the countries between herself and Russia merely resulted in those countries pursuing foreign policies of mutual cooperation despite that Russian absence, and the results of these efforts speak for themselves. The Visegrad Group, created and championed by the Czechs in the 1990s, is one of the single most successful initiatives of cooperation among European countries within the European Union. Built on that foundation, there is mutual cooperation in electrical infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, defense, and emergency services. The 2024 floods in Central Europe and how effectively Poles and Czechs were able to work together in flood relief are proof of that. There's also the Polish reconciliation with Lithuania and wider cooperation with the Baltics. But above all, probably the single most significant Polish achievement was the close alliance they built with the United States. The Americans increasingly see Poland as its closest and most reliable ally in Europe, and this is due to decades of long, hard foreign policy work by the Poles, while Estonia built closer ties of friendship and military cooperation with the United Kingdom, and Latvia built close military ties to Canada. There's the digitalization of the Estonian state, which is something that is being copied in cooperation throughout all other Baltic states, as well as in Poland and the Czech Republic. And what is the thing that we notice in all of this? Well, it is something that we can't really see. It's a glaring German absence. By choosing and clinging on to an Ostpolitik that prioritized markets and favored Russia, Germany massively shot itself in the foot. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Germany lost out on decades of opportunities to build new friendships and to cooperate deeper with her neighbors, while her neighbors did exactly that and left Germany standing alone in a corner as the odd one out by 2022. There's an irony in all of this. Germany claimed throughout all of this to be a champion of European integration and cooperation, but by being so hyper-focused on Russia as a priority for 30 years of foreign policy and ignoring those between herself and Russia, Germany advanced the exact opposite course, squarely placing herself outside of policy initiatives mainly driven in her absence by countries like Poland, Czechia, and Sweden that bound the countries between herself and Russia closer together. Now, since 2022, that Ostpolitik is pretty much dead. Germany has to confront the fact that it ended up in a very lonely position in Europe. It will have no choice but to reorientate its foreign policy in Europe, strip itself of any delusions of being the leader of Europe, and prioritize the rebuilding of trust with its direct neighbors, primarily with Poland. Because while Germany wasted decades on a pointless pursuit with Russia, it was Poland that took the initiative to do the European bridge building that Germany failed to do. And it is this foreign policy and its results that we will focus on in the next videos. Thank you for watching. I will be back with another video very soon. And thank you to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description to get a free 30-day premium subscription. See you all soon.